cosmic canyons.
In the Shadows of Mercury. By Josef Rossmann. With a deep howl, the MCS Aurora landing module descended through Mercury's thin atmosphere. The 5 crew members listened to the roar of the control jets and strapped themselves into their seats. Outside, the sky glowed in unnatural colors. Between the glistening day side and the ice-cold night side, a narrow strip of reddish-orange haze stretched out, in which the machine began its descent. No one spoke a word, but the tension was palpable. They were about to enter a barely explored zone. Leah Moreno, the expedition leader, took a deep breath through the visor of her helmet. On a display, she watched the outside temperatures, which were still above 70 degrees even at dusk. Despite the whirring internal suit cooler, sweat ran down her forehead. In her hand, she held a pad with notes from old mission reports, fragmentary references to Dlukus and unknown structures. It was precisely these hints that had lured them here. Logan White, pilot and head of security, sat in the co-pilot's seat. In a sonorous voice, he reported, "Speed decrease stable. Ready for ground contact in 30 seconds. His fingers danced across the console, his thick gloves touching switches and throttle controls. A row behind them sat Dr. Hina Okoye, the xenobiologist, and Samir Dekic, the high-temperature engineer. Both were watching the camera images from outside. Sand like dust swirled in clouds, hitting the ship's walls and almost obscuring the view. Dr. Okoye couldn't help whispering, "It looks like everything's been corroded or burned." Cliff Howard, the last in line, was conspicuously silent. The usually impatient and inquisitive botanist seemed tense. Only his slightly trembling hands in his lap betrayed his excitement. "We're really here now?" he muttered. "I can't wait to get out of here." The machine lurched as the landing skids touched down. Violent vibrations shook the fuselage. Seconds later, the Aurora came to a standstill. For a moment, the team stared silently at the instruments displaying temperature and pressure. The external microphones transmitted an eerie noise. Outside, the twilight looked like quicksand made of light and shadow. Leah was the first to speak. "Everything okay, Logan?" "We're safe," he replied tersely. Outside temperature 72 degrees, no major cracks visible in the ground. He wiped a bead of sweat from his face. "We should set up the outer tent as quickly as possible before it gets even hotter." The practiced procedure began. From the cockpit, they disconnected the cargo compartment's pressure lock, secured the ship against the extreme climate, and unloaded the first equipment. When the bulkheads opened, the humid heat blew toward them like the breath of a red-hot furnace. Fine-grained dust swirled around their legs, leaving sticky layers on the metal floor. Now everyone had to activate the helmet of their protective suit, which had a transparent visor with an integrated cooling mask. Under Leia's guidance, Samir unfolded a sturdy outer tent made of lightweight metal struts and heat-resistant composite material. They set it up near the Aurora's landing struts to create a minimally protected camp. Logan checked the measurements while Dr. Okoye took soil and air samples. Then, barely 10 steps away from the ship, they discovered the remains of previous missions: deformed struts, burnt metal beams whose alloys had dissolved into reddish corrosion. Leia cautiously approached a bent container on which an old Earth registration number was vaguely visible. "Someone must have been here," she murmured, "but it all looks very deserted." Cliff Howard stood a little apart. His gaze swept across the horizon where the glowing red twilight merged into thick dust. In his mind, the reports about the Dlukus and sunken facilities sounded like a promise. Perhaps there were plant forms here that no human had ever seen before. His heart pounded as he said quietly, "This world, it's full of secrets." Logan heard him and replied, "Hopefully it won't eat us." Then he went over to Leah, who was comparing the data with the archived maps. None of them were reliable. Some showed only rough outlines, crevices, gorges, possible lava chambers. In between were notes such as Dlukus sightings, strange structures, and caution, high heat exposure. Leia straightened up and said, "We'll keep our routes short for now. I just want to map the immediate area and collect samples. We'll set up a base camp around the ship. Samir, how's our cooling unit?" The engineer wiped the sweat from his forehead. "We've got enough for a few days, but that's it. For the rest, we'll need constant support from the Aurora." Leah nodded resolutely. "Okay, everyone. In an hour or two, we'll set off on our first reconnaissance mission. Keep an eye out for unusual rock formations or creatures. Anything we find could be important." Outside, the warm wind howled like a distant predator. The day on Mercury was long, but their time was short. This land knew no mercy, and every step could sink into the glowing dust. Answers awaited in the semi-darkness of this planet, or dangers that none of them had anticipated. The hours after landing passed quickly. Although the temperature rose only slowly at dusk, it was clear to everyone that they had to plan their exploratory tours wisely, because on Mercury, the temperature can quickly go from just bearable to life-threatening. The small base tent next to the Aurora was stuffy and cramped, accompanied by the constant hum of cooling fans. Leia had decided to explore the surrounding area within a radius of about 2 kilometers before venturing out on longer tours. The maps they had so far were incomplete or contradictory. No sooner had the tent been pitched and the temperature inside made reasonably bearable than Leia divided the team into groups of 2 and 3. "We'll split up for a bit," she explained as everyone gathered around a portable spotlight. "Logan and Samir will map the geological formations north of the ship. There are some striking rock formations that we saw on the satellite image. Dr. Okoye and I will examine the rubble field over there for biomuster patterns. Cliff," she said, giving the botanist a serious look, "you're welcome to come along, but be careful and please don't rush into the hot zone yet." Cliff pursed his lips as if reluctantly agreeing. His expression betrayed his impatience. He was eager to get to the strange, spiky plants he had spotted during the approach, but they were further out in the blazing sun. He replied curtly, "That's fine. I'll stick to the plan, for now." Then they split into 2 groups. Logan and Samir set off first. They were equipped with rock analyzers, a portable radar probe, and provisions for a few hours. The bulky gloves made every movement difficult, and the dusty wind further hampered their visibility. Nevertheless, they made good progress, avoiding the cracks in the red earth that suddenly appeared. Leia, Dr. Okoye, and Cliff followed a path to the southwest. There were several hills that stood out clearly from the flat surroundings. Older records indicated that there might be traces of measuring devices that previous missions had installed or left behind. The march through the glistening twilight was sweaty. The temperature gauge on Leia's wrist climbed steadily, and she felt her neck getting damp, despite her cooling suit. Dr. Okoye walked beside her. His face was focused, his eyes fixed on a portable scanner that was constantly searching for biological traces. Cliff stood at the end of the group, his gaze wandering, as if he expected an alien creature to appear at any moment. After 300 to 400 meters, Leah and her companions came across metallic fragments, bent rods, dented cans, and somewhere a partially faded earth flag on a sheet of metal. Only the red and blue pattern was still visible. The rest was burned or peeled off. Probably an old outpost, Dr. Okoye guessed. She crouched down and wiped the dust off the sign. SK-14. Hard to make out, It could have been part of a mission 10 or 15 years ago, but officially, no one has been active here for ages. Cliff came closer and shook his head. No wonder we have so little data. This area devours everything. Leah noticed a strange pattern on the ground, a curved furrow, as if a large device or drilling rig had melted in the heat and half sunk into the ground. "I wonder what's down there," she murmured. A signal in her earpiece interrupted her thoughts. Okoye's bioscanner showed slight fluctuations. "Changes in microbial contamination," the xenobiologist explained excitedly, checking the display. "There could be life somewhere in the deeper layers or cracks." Curious, they all groped for the shadow of a metal fragment. Sure enough, they discovered a thin, greenish film, probably mold or algae. "It's hard to believe anything could survive here," Cliff marveled. He grabbed a sample tube. "An analysis could show us how these organisms withstand the heat." Suddenly, everyone flinched when they heard dark voices in the wind. A sound pierced the silence, quiet but eerie. A gurgling, followed by a hoarse scratching. They hastily scanned the crevices in the rock. Nothing. Just wind-blown sand. "Was that voices?" whispered Cliff. Dr. Okoye looked visibly alarmed. "It didn't sound like an animal." Leah took a deep breath. "Maybe it's just the wind in the canyon, but stay alert." Almost simultaneously, the ground shook. It was a slight tremor, but strong enough to make Okoye stagger. Dust swirled. Then everything was quiet again. "Marsquake, or rather a Mercury," Leah muttered dryly. "We have to be careful. The crust is unstable." She pointed to the ridge. "We should go a little further, then turn back. Without Logan and Samir, I don't want to take any more risks here." Cliff, on the other hand, glanced toward the lighter-colored plain, where more heat was gathering, and the air was shimmering. The spiky succulents could be there. Just a quick look. Leah shook her head. "Later, we're staying together. I can't lose you here." Her voice sounded more serious than she wanted it to. Cliff controlled himself and remained silent, even though his gaze remained impatient. After about an hour, during which they secured a few more rock samples and algae leaves, Leah decided that they should return. The sun was beating down harder, and small dust devils were swirling around. Just before they started their return journey, Logan and Samir reported in via radio. "Everything's quiet. We've only found some fragile rock formations and traces that aren't man-made." The voice sounded distorted, apparently due to interference. Visibly exhausted but unharmed, Leah, Okoye, and Cliff finally reached the tent camp. They stowed their findings, took off their helmets, and breathed a sigh of relief. The cooler air inside felt like paradise. Cliff didn't let go of his test tubes and said, "We should analyze them immediately. I have a feeling we've stumbled upon something that surpasses everything we know." His eyes flashed with the same fascination Leah had noticed when he talked about his plant projects. A soft sigh escaped her. His enthusiasm was good, but she sensed that it could be dangerous for him. When Logan and Samir returned to camp, they looked sweaty, but also fascinated. "I think we found footprints," Logan said dryly. "And scratch marks. Very strange. No sign of any living creatures." Leah gave him a thoughtful look. It would soon be evening, and the heat would only slowly subside, or other dangers lurked in the deeper areas. Her curiosity was piqued, but she knew that with every step they took, they were taking a greater risk. The thought of the so-called Dlukus crept uninvited into her mind. Cliff had meanwhile retreated to the small laboratory on board to examine his microbial samples. Samir began analyzing rock fragments with the scanner. Outside the tent, twilight hung heavy over everything. A pale red in the sky made the camp look like an alien world. there seemed to be a whisper in the red, like a distant breath, warning them again and again. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt a growing unease. They had only just begun to explore this rugged terrain, and the mysterious Dlukus were perhaps already much too close. In the diffuse twilight, as the red-hot sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon of Mercury, the 5 explorers gathered once more around the glowing cone of the base tent. A steady wind blew the sand into graceful arcs, but the surroundings remained alien, as if denying any human presence. Leah Moreno had sat down at a makeshift table made of solar panels. Seismic curves, heat flow values, and coordinates flickered across the pad in front of her. She studied the data intently as Logan White joined her. "The ground movements are increasing," he said calmly but alertly. "No immediate danger, but we must remember that the tectonics here are very active." Leah nodded and sighed softly. "Samir's notes mention enlarging cracks. If this continues, we could face landslides or crevices." Meanwhile, Dr. Okoye and Samir studied the latest samples. They had set up a makeshift laboratory inside the aurora, where they were now analyzing fragments of algae and fungi found on the wreckage of old equipment. "This is absolutely unique," Okoye marveled. "These are structures reminiscent of extremophiles, but genetically completely different. And here, metallic nanoparticles. Could be residues from mining." Samir looked concerned. "These organisms seem to bind metal ions. Maybe that's their trick for survival. We just don't know enough." Cliff Howard stood a little apart, comparing archive notes with the terrain scan. He glanced uneasily toward the tent entrance, where a dark red hue was spreading across the twilight sky. "We have to keep going to the edge of the sun," he said suddenly. "That's the only place we'll find those spiky succulents. We should see them before the heat becomes unbearable." Leah looked at him. "Cliff, I know you're keen on this, but we have hardly any data on the earthquakes. It could quickly become dangerous. We need to know what we're getting ourselves into." Cliff frowned but said nothing. He knew that Leah was in charge, and that he couldn't do anything on his own. Nevertheless, his impatience was palpable. Mercury had no typical night, but in the twilight zone, dusk seemed to merge into an unnatural twilight. Around midnight, Samir suddenly burst in. "Alarm!" The outside camera. Together, they rushed to the monitor. There were blurry movements to be seen. Flat, hunched figures, moving in a semicircle around the camp. "Dlukus," whispered Dr. Okoye. The blurry image showed 2, then 5 figures that didn't dare enter the brightly lit tent. Frowning, Logan drew his handgun. "This could be a diversion. Maybe they want to drive us away." Leah decided to stay in the tent. "Who knows how aggressive they are? Let's watch them first. We don't know enough about their intentions. Maybe they're just curious." 2 tense hours passed. The shadows flitted about, but no attack followed. Finally, they disappeared. A few times, they thought they heard gurgling sounds, a strange throat language. Then all that remained was the monotonous sound of the wind. The next morning, the expedition set off in different directions. As the first light of day colored the twilight, everything seemed relatively calm. The temperature had dropped slightly, a respite before the next heat wave. Leah called the team together. "We have provisions and coolant for a few days. We should cover more ground. Samir and Dr. Okoye, you take a look at the old metal frames and wrecked equipment. Secure anything that's still usable. Logan and I will head west to the crevices and measure the rock data. Cliff, you can make a detour south to the succulents, but stay in radio contact and don't go deeper into the sun zone than agreed." Cliff smiled briefly. "Deal. If it gets too hot, I'll turn back immediately." A few hours passed as everyone set off on their respective paths. They knew that their window of opportunity was small before the sun began to beat down mercilessly again. As Leah and Logan climbed over a hilltop, they saw strikingly straight edges in a hollow. Stone slabs, some pierced by metal parts, column-like fragments, the first signs of a temple, like the remains of an architectural complex. "That looks like foundations," said Leah, running her hand over a smoothly polished edge. It could have been an old pedestal, or something highly technical. Logan tapped the stone, and it sounded like glass. Not an earthly alloy. This stuff is ancient. He squinted at a square pattern on the ground and said, "Maybe part of a larger complex further down?" Leah felt a tingling sensation. Possible. There are stories about Dlukus temple. But if these structures are really that advanced, they can't have been built by primitive beings. Who knows what's hidden here? At the same time, Cliff was stalking southward alone, only a mile or two from base camp. But the sun was rising quickly, and the temperature jumped to 75, 78 degrees. Cliff was sweating, but his heart was beating with energy. He chased after the spiky succulents that stood like a dream in the heat. Finally, he saw them. White, almost transparent cushions with spiky stems protruding from them. A botanical wonder in the midst of the glowing stone. "There they are," he whispered reverently. He bent down to cut a sample. Then he heard a scratching sound. Startled, he turned around. In the distance, a dwarf-like figure disappeared behind a rock and let out a throaty warning cry. A scaly body, 2 sparkling eyes, a Dlukus. "Unbelievable," Cliff whispered. His radio crackled. Somewhere, Leah sent him a choppy, "Cliff, situation?" But the interference made it almost impossible to hear a reply. Cliff realized he had better return. As he cut off the last thorny shoot, however, he saw a darting streak out of the corner of his eye again. A tremor shook the rocks. With his heart pounding, he ran off, the sample safely stowed away. Meanwhile, Dr. Okoye and Samir continued to search for the tracks and equipment left behind from previous missions. The welds they found showed unusual alloys, as if foreign materials had been glued to Earth-made machines. "This doesn't belong to a normal conveyor," Samir remarked as he examined a piece of rod. "Too light, too strangely assembled. The miners probably discovered something here back then and tried to incorporate it." Okoye nodded. In a hollow lay charred tools whose logos were almost completely burned away. They must have failed. The heat, the radiation, or something else, destroyed them. A dull rumbling tore them from their thoughts. A crack ran through the rock. There was no reason to panic, but it showed how fragile the zone was, and again, a shadow flitted across it. Okoye shivered. "We're not alone here, Samir." Hours later, everyone returned to the tent, exhausted and sweaty, but full of impressions. The sun was high, and the temperature had risen to over 80 degrees Celsius. Leah and Logan reported possible foundations of an advanced structure. Dr. Okoye and Samir told of their findings of strange metal parts. And again, everyone spoke of indistinct movements in the vicinity. There was silence for a while because Cliff didn't come back. Only after half an hour did he appear, sweaty but triumphant. "I saw them, those succulents. Unbelievable, and a Dlukus was watching me." The group asked in alarm. "Contact? Was there an encounter?" "No," said Cliff. "He was gone quickly. He seemed more curious than aggressive." Leah put her hand on his shoulder. "I'm glad you came back safely. Who knows what would have happened if they had attacked you? We shouldn't push our luck." Cliff's eyes lit up with joy, but Leah exchanged a worried glance with Samir. They had to be careful that the botanist didn't put himself in danger. At that moment, the earth shook again. A rumbling sound came from deep below, Everyone sensed that time was running out before something bigger would happen. The group examined the outer areas of what they believed to be a temple. Logan, Samir, Dr. Okoye, and Leah took turns scanning the rocks and energy fields. But Cliff Howard withdrew more and more, driven by the fixed idea that a key to adapting to extreme heat could be found in the glowing zone. In his logs and notes, he had repeatedly noted that there must be fiery green flora in a certain zone, only 2 to 3 kilometers further into the light. While the others explored a passageway in the ruins, Cliff sneaked away. Leah called after him and warned him, "Cliff, stay with us. It's too dangerous." But he didn't listen to her. The glowing spark of his botanical obsession burned in his eyes. Shortly thereafter, he stood on the threshold of the scorching heat. Here, the ground was already over 75 degrees Celsius, and dust swirled everywhere. But then he actually saw it, clusters of spiky succulents that shimmered almost white, as if defying all reason. "Unbelievable," he whispered. He hurriedly took out his sample containers and cut off some thorny stems. At that moment, the earth shook. A thunderous rumbling crept up his back. Several small, hunched creatures emerged from the crevices in the rocks, the Dlukus. They seemed to surround him. With relentless speed, they hurled lumpy, rock-hard projectiles. Cliff let out a scream that was barely audible in the scorching heat. His radio transmitted only garbled fragments. "Fire green! Dlukus! Oh God!" The noise swallowed the rest. Then the signal broke off. Leah, Logan, Samir, and Okoye listened in horror as Cliff's radio suddenly fell silent. They rushed to his last known location, but found only broken hoses, footprints, and swirling sand. The ground was red hot, the air shimmering and impenetrable. Cliff Howard had disappeared. Thus ended the moment when the botanical dreamer had risked his life to uncover the secret of the fiery green plants. What remained was a mystery. Where had he gone? Had the Dlukus kidnapped him, or had he fallen into a crevasse? And what did he really know in the end, except that the world here was bigger and more threatening than he had ever imagined? After Cliff's last radio message faded away, an oppressive silence descended on the base camp. The four who remained, Leah, Logan, Samir, and Dr. Okoye, stayed inside the tent for protection as fine dust swept incessantly over them. Leah looked uneasily at the map on her datapad. The coordinates of Cliff's last signal were little more than a speck in the middle of an unpredictable heat zone. "Either the Dlukus have kidnapped him, or he's lying injured in a crevasse," she said. Logan, who had his hand on the radio button, muttered, "His signal disappears immediately when he's outside. The heat or something else is blocking any echo." His gaze swept across the landscape. Meanwhile, Samir checked the energy anomalies. "It's not just natural heat. There are pulses that are hard to explain, as if some mechanism is at work deep down." Dr. Okoye agreed. "Probably part of those ruins. But why did the Dlukus attack Cliff? Are they more aggressive than we thought?" The devastating realization dawned on everyone that Cliff might not be saved. Nevertheless, their thirst for knowledge was strong enough to search for explanations. "Maybe we'll find clues on how to follow him," Leah said quietly. "But aren't we putting our entire mission at risk?" Uneasy, the team agreed on a compromise, a local search limited to the outlying areas. At the same time, they wanted to continue investigating the mysterious temple to find out more about the Dlukus and the anomalies. While analyzing the dust outside, they discovered some footprints, small and strange, mingled with Cliff's tracks. Logan felt his way along a kind of rock niche. Suddenly, a shrill, metallic screech sounded, like a voice coming from inside the rock. Everything fell silent as quickly as it had come, and all that could be heard was the soft humming of the wind. Shaken and perplexed, they retreated, The orange-red twilight swallowed every trace, as if Mercury himself had erased Cliff Howard's existence. They could feel Leah's gaze staring into the void, aware that the next step could either lead them further into the unknown or condemn them to failure. Night fell like a heavy blanket over the camp, and the four felt a deep unease in their hearts. The loss of Cliff weighed heavily on their souls, a cry lost in the darkness of the Mercurian wasteland. The group decided to focus on the mysterious structure they believed to be a Dlukus temple. In reality, they increasingly believed that it concealed a highly advanced technical structure that had aged over the centuries of the Mercurian wasteland. Early one morning, before the sun was too high, Leah, Logan, Samir, and Dr. Okoye ventured deeper into the jagged halls and corridors they had only explored superficially so far. The air grew cooler, but also more humid, and the faint glow of the engravings on the walls flickered as ancient energy currents pulsed there. No sooner had they entered one of the labyrinthine corridors than a tremendous roar shook the ground. Mechanical gates slammed shut as if the complex had a will of its own and wanted to separate and confuse the intruders. Stone splinters rained down, dust settled in the cracks. The old walls boomed, proclaiming their unbroken resistance. Amidst the chaos, the four of them were almost lost. Logan and Samir were caught in a collapse. Dr. Okoye called their names, but their voices were drowned out by the deafening noise. Leah's heart raced as she fought her way through the clouds of dust. She knew that every breath could be her last. Before she knew it, she had lost contact with the others. Heavy debris blocked the way. A shower of sparks showed how the machines of yesteryear groaned and glowed. And for a fleeting moment, she thought of Cliff, who had once been lost in a similarly brutal scene. Whatever this temple was, it seemed to react with frightening precision. Was it a trap, a self-defending station? The Dlukus scurried somewhere on the edge. She heard their chuckles in the semi-darkness, mixed with the metallic echo of blows. Amidst this torment, Leah felt her companions fall silent one by one. They were being beaten to death with stones, torn into crevices, or captured inside passages. Only radio messages, short and choppy, bore witness to the struggle. Then there was dead silence, so the group finally broke up. The planned research mission had turned into a fight for survival. Bleeding and trembling, Leah clung to the few pieces of data she had been able to save, hoping that at least the knowledge of this terrible place would enable her to escape. When the last rumblings of the collapse had died away, Leah Moreno was left alone in the damp, stuffy corridors. The crashing of stones and the mechanical rattling that continued in the ruins seemed like a morbid pulse, a rhythm in which this temple moved and breathed. Only fragments were visible on the walls in the semi-darkness, clues to technical wonders that she could no longer decipher. The screams and shouts had long since died away. Her body ached from falls and wounds, but she staggered forward, driven by a strange mixture of guilt, longing, and the will to escape. Cliff was gone. Logan, Samir, and Okoye. None of them responded. Perhaps they had been buried or killed. Leah felt a crack in the ground and felt her way along its edge. The faint smell of damp rock rose up. The heat was muffled down here, but the oppressive confinement weighed on her senses. As if in a trance, she followed a faint, pale glow coming from a higher crevice in the rock, her only escape route. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the crevice, squeezed through, and stumbled into the glistening world above. Blood-red light fell upon her, the sky glowing in feverish colors. The contrast between the dark labyrinth and this desolate, endless outside world made her retreat in a daze. Leah sank into the reddish dust, breathing heavily. Her companions were lost, her own life hung by a thread, but she was free. With her last ounce of strength, she activated her portable radio, even though the signals were weak. This was no place for triumph. It was a matter of sheer survival. The ruins behind her whispered softly, as if they had devoured her soul. Thus ended her escape from the shadows that surrounded the temple. But a burning question raged in Leah's chest. Who had created this structure? What motives lay behind this combination of technology and stone that seemed to become immortal in the heat? And how would she ever mourn her lost comrades and uncover these secrets? In the glowing red expanse, far from any sign of human life, an old mining mast rose up, a relic from forgotten times, watching over bizarre dunes in silent silence. It was rusty and crooked, but seemed to have one last function, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Leah Moreno dragged herself here after endless hours of wandering. Her body was exhausted, her soul consumed by grief. But in her hands, she held a handful of data chips and records, the last legacy of an expedition that had been swallowed up by Mercury. The mast offered little protection, but Leah connected it to her makeshift transmitter. With trembling fingers, she tried to channel energy into the old wires. And sure enough, a faint, choppy signal flickered into life. "This is Leah Moreno," she managed to say. Her voice sounded fragile. The heat was oppressive, but every sound penetrated the merciless wasteland. A cry for help, a last testimony of humanity in this harsh world. At that moment, the rusty tower was more important than any state-of-the-art satellite. It was the thin thread that promised hope. As the signal faded into the emptiness of space, Leah stood silently, staring at the flickering horizon. Leah Moreno, the last survivor of the company, had sent her message, the echo of a tragedy and the hint of an immeasurable secret that still slumbered in the ruins. And in the desolate expanse, the heart of the planet continued to beat, closed and unforgiving, as if thirsting to preserve further mysteries until someone dared to step into the shadows of Mercury once again. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow. Your support helps keep these tales alive. Until next time, stay curious. See you in the cosmic canyons.